Welcome into another edition of Inside Carolina's Next Level. I'm Tommy Ashley. That is Greg Barnes. We're sponsored by Johnny T-Shirt and JohnnyT-Shirt.com. Greg, it's been a while since we've done a Next Level. It's been quite hectic with late summer and children coming and going and events happening. And now here we are, I guess 3 games. We're recording this on Wednesday afternoon, 3 days away from North Carolina's season opener against South Carolina. Tell everybody what Greg Barnes has been up to, but also what we're doing here today, because this is going to be a fascinating discussion.
Well, Tommy, as you mentioned, when you've got kids like we have, it gets very hectic in the summertime. So staying busy, but also taking a little bit of a break from this, and we've got a long list of good guests coming up this fall into the basketball season, and we thought it'd be a great way to start the season by bringing in an advanced metrics guy that I have followed for a long, long time. Brian Fremeau of used to be footballoutsiders.com. His site is bcftoys.com. Brian, thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here. If you've been reading my stuff for a long, long time, that means I've been at it a long, long time, I guess, too.
It has been. And Tommy, I want to give you a little bit of background. Everybody that's watching this and that knows me knows that I've covered Carolina for about 20 years. And when Butch Davis came to town back in 2007, I sat down with him probably his first year, and we're just talking about his offense, the defense, and numbers that he was looking toward, what was important to him. And I kept bringing up total defense and total offense and all these different benchmarks. And Butch said, those numbers really don't mean anything. And this is 07. This is a long time ago. And he said, what you really need to look at is yards per play. Because depending on if you're Fisher to Berry and you're really slowing down the game, you can really shift those numbers, those total numbers, however you want. But if you look at yards per play, well, now all of a sudden we have a better idea of how efficient you're being on either side of the ball. And so I went with that and I ran with it for a while. And that was a very important metric. And it still is. I mean, it's Bill Connolly does that with SP Plus. That's a good metric. However, fast forward 5 years, 2012, in comes Larry Fedora. Larry Fedora at the time was like, I'm going to run 85 plays a game. This is what I want to do. And so you start looking at total defense, total offense, and you realize, okay, it really doesn't matter. You have to look at the yards per play. And I mentioned that to Larry in one of our off-the-record conversations. He says, you know what, Greg? It's an important metric, right? I mean, it's something to look at for sure. However, I can average 8 yards per play and get down to the 5-yard line and either turn it over or kick a field goal. And what does that say about me? Not a whole lot. What I'm trying to do is score points. And that brings us to Brian. And what Larry said, and this is 12, 13 years ago, he was very much the idea it's not so much about yards per play, it's points per possession. And that is what Brian started doing however many years ago, Brian. I know BCF Toys, I guess, goes back to 07 if I'm seeing it correctly. But if you could kind of explain your FEI metric, what you try to do with that, how that came to be, and kind of where things stand right now.
Sure. Didn't know I had a fan in Larry Fedora, or maybe I've been actually working with these numbers, I guess, is for 20 years. I started playing with possession data way back in 2003, and it was really a way to win some arguments against brothers and family members, and try to add a little bit of fact to a conversation about the game we love. And then in order to win those arguments, I started collecting more data. So I really started as I'm a Notre Dame football fan. I started tracking Notre Dame first and foremost, but I really needed the comparison data to see how they stood up against the rest of the college football world. And until I found a home at Football Outsiders in late 2006 and really started writing for them regularly in 2007, it's now become a place that people can pay attention to, and I've been tracking those numbers ever since. I actually have to pause here for a second, if that's all right, guys.
Sure.
So I've been working with the data for 20 years and publishing the data for a little over 16 years. And yeah, you talk about points per possession has been kind of stuck in my head for almost as long as I've been a football fan, because the possessions are back and forth in college football. It's not anything quite like baseball stats, but everybody gets the same amount of half innings in a baseball game. Everybody gets the same. The two teams get the same amount of opportunities with the ball, generally speaking. One team might end up with one extra possession at the end, but how you maximize those? Do you move the ball, and do you move the ball into scoring position, and do you score when you do, and do you stop the opponent from doing the same? And so my core data numbers are simply those data points: the number of possessions, where you began, where you ended, what did you do with them, what was the result. There's a lot more nuance to the specifics of some of my offensive and defensive analysis that goes into turning the ball over versus moving into a field goal range and coming away with 0 points. But the core numbers are basically that: score when you have the ball and stop the opponent when they don't. And I found that those numbers are pretty meaningful in terms of both projecting forward and evaluating team performances over the course of the season.
Brian, let me get in here, and I mentioned it to you off the air. Sort of the data. I mean, it's got to get in the system somehow. Explain to us, because it's fascinating. I'm looking at your website, and I've been reading up since we were going to talk to you, and I'm like, how in the hell does he know all this? Like, he doesn't watch every game. He doesn't.
No.
He can't possibly. How does that work? Just for the layperson that really, not necessarily against the metric aspect of it, maybe doesn't understand the metric aspect of it. How does it work for you?
Well, you can definitely call me a quintessential stat nerd who doesn't watch the games. Not because I don't enjoy them, but you don't have time to watch them all. But I do collect all of the data, and I do, on a spreadsheet, watch and go basically possession by possession and review the games that happen every week. There's a couple of data sources out there. First and foremost, every team maintains drive level data and has been doing so for pretty much the last 20 years. So you can access any given team's results on a drive by drive basis pretty accessibly. That's it's pretty labor intensive to have to look up every individual team. So there are some great resources online that kind of pull that data together, either directly from team sites or scrape sites that publish play by play. I mean, I've got colleagues, like you mentioned, Bill Connolly in SP Plus, who dig even deeper. I mean, they're collecting every event at a much more granular level in terms of the play and who the personnel involved. On my level, at the possession level, it's a pretty rudimentary data set. I mean, it's in depth when you have 11,000 games over the course of 16 years, but it's a pretty rudimentary amount of data per game. It's around 25 possessions a game on average. It's there might be so you're tracking those numbers, the starting and end point, et cetera. And yeah, there's some great resources. Collegefootballdata.com is a great resource that provides exportable data. I do have to spend some time, no matter what my data source is, not just reviewing it so I kind of understand a little bit of what happened, but to find what I guess I would call discrepancies in the data that are worth investigating. You might see, for instance, the same team appear to have the possession consecutively, and you might wonder, well, something happened in between there, and by looking up that game a little more closely, you might find out that there was a turnover on a turnover, like an interception return that was fumbled back, and there's sort of a missing possession. So I do a little bit of that data work on my end, just to basically make what I consider to be the source of truth. And I've got a big old spreadsheet worth of data dating back to 2007 that I built all of my kind of analysis off of. So I only know that teams average 2.2 points per drive because I've got hundreds of thousands of drives that tell me that over a 20-year period. And so when teams outperform that on the offensive end or hold teams to less than that on the defensive end, that's an indicator that they're a certain degree better or worse than average. And that's kind of how I build my work. I'm not a math data scientist by any means. In fact, most of the actual math behind the engine is pretty rudimentary arithmetic. I mean, I've got a little bit of a head for it, I suppose, but it isn't rocket science at the end of the day. It's a little bit of just taking as much data in and consistently, evaluating and running the same numbers for all teams so you can compare them.
There's so much interesting in data on Brian's website. I encourage everybody to go check it out. One of the most interesting things to me is not even related to per possession scoring necessarily on a team level. It's more kind of overall, and that's on his very front page. It's drive efficiency by starting field position. And one of the reasons that's fascinating to me is a lot of people assume, hey, if you get to the red zone, you should be scoring touchdowns every time. And the data does not say that. I mean, just looking at the numbers here, 421 drives over the last, 15 years, I guess, 16 years now. The start on the 20, average 4.63 points per drive.
Yeah, and only 55% of them scored touchdowns.
Yeah.
That's a great example of, I wouldn't have intuitively known that. And I only know that because I've got the metrics to prove it. Because as a fan, you're watching a game. Oh, this is a scoring opportunity. They have to put it in, and you find out that yes, the successful teams do. The successful teams are much higher than 55%. The unsuccessful ones aren't. But when you're how better or worse than average is, you gotta the numbers tell you a completely different story.
And one question I wanted to ask, and I'm going to use North Carolina as an example here, Brian, but looking back to last year, and one aspect of FEI which makes it so relevant is not just the per possession scoring, but it's adjusted for opponent. In North Carolina, if you look at last year, Carolina was a fringe top 25 team. They were top 25 for most of the year. They ended up number 61 overall in FEI, and people see that saying, wait a minute. They were a lot better than that. But when you break it out into offense, defense, North Carolina was 18th offensively, but 118th defensively. We know it was not a good defense by any stretch, and this kind of highlights that point. When Carolina's 18th offensively and 118th defensively, kind of how do you come to those numbers? And kind of break that down for us if you can in terms of how that applies to quality of opponent.
Sure. Some of those opponent adjustments are, I mean, there is some proprietary, I guess, number adjusting that I do. And again, it's not as if I publish every formula in my database for someone else to run, but hopefully it's somewhat intuitive. If you play a group of strong teams and you play them well, even if you aren't winning, you're going to bubble up in my ratings because relative to average, you're a strong team. The theoretical team that plays 10 top 10 teams and goes 2-8 against them, but plays them all competitively, might be closer to a top 10 team than anybody would want to admit. They're 2-8, but they might be the 20th best team in the country if they were that successful against that level. So some of that adjustment is just to account for. There's 133 teams this year in FBS. There's wide range of skill. So that the opponent adjustments is one element of that. The basically raw defensive efficiency is maybe where the 118th number comes first and foremost. I mean, North Carolina last year ranked in the 110s or worse in pretty much every defensive efficiency category that I track, and it's not a great story to tell. And these are different numbers. They were 120th in touchdown rate, opponent touchdown rate. 37% of opponent drives resulted in a touchdown. They were 120th in what I call drive efficiency, which is really scoring and stopping adjusted for your starting field position. They were 124th in busted drive rate. This is one of my nuanced stats of a busted drive is when an offense moves the ball 0 or negative yards. So the defense, not only just won the possession by getting a 3-and-out or worse, like they might have had a pick in 3 plays or less, but they might have moved the opponent back. Those busted drives, and North Carolina's defense didn't do much of that at all. It was 5.6% of drives last year. So those numbers, I mean, that 118th is backed by a lot of raw data points, and then the adjustment from the opponent's face. They didn't necessarily face a there's certainly some strong offensive teams that they played, but on the whole, did they play a well above average set of offenses? Not necessarily. So it works out that way. They actually haven't. I mean, North Carolina, I don't think has posted, if I'm looking at my numbers here, a top 50 defense in my opponent adjusted ratings since 2013, and only twice, maybe three or four times before that. So it's like defense has not been a hallmark of that team in my numbers, and it hasn't been led by that. An elite offense, a truly elite offense, which I know they have the potential to be this year with Drake May, can overcome a lousy defense. USC Trojans were a good example of that last year. They were downright terrible on defense, and they still won 11 games because they had the number 1 or number 2 opponent adjusted offense. So when you can perform at such an extreme offensive level, you can kind of overcome it. Now, I'll also say, I don't think that puts you in a position to win a playoff game, or as we saw with USC, even get to it. So I do think that there's still a ceiling for that, but it takes, the truly elite contenders, the Georgias, the Alabamas, the Ohio States of the world, and Michigan's climbing into that realm, it feels like this year, are elite in an opponent adjusted rating on both sides of the ball. They're certainly top 10 on both sides of the ball the last few years, rather than being a half team that might be okay on one side of the ball and terrific on the other. So I'm rambling a little bit, but I hope that gets at where those numbers come from and what I'm seeing in Carolina.
No, it's fascinating to me to listen to, because we talk about and we've heard how Carolina's defense got better as the year progressed. I don't know if the numbers show that, and I know Greg's opinion on that, and I know that we've discussed it. But one point I wanted to make, y'all mentioned opponent's 20. Starting a drive on an opponent's 20 gets you 4.63 yard or points per possession over the course of a lot of games. Well, even if you start on the opponent's 1 yard line, you're not guaranteed 7 points.
That's right.
6.48, even on the opponent's 1 yard line. Fascinating. You score a lot, 90.5%, but
yeah, but even that, 1 out of every 10 drives that starts on the 1 doesn't score a touchdown. It's kind of an amazing number, because you'd think intuitively it's more like 95+% touchdown rate. And some of that, and I don't know that I've done such a deep dive on coaching tendencies to know this to be true, but I kind of suspect it. Teams in good field position, a lot of them play conservatively. They're not necessarily playing for a field goal, but because the field goal's in the bag and they don't want to cough it up, I wonder if some of those numbers are because they're not playing as aggressively as they could or should, or even that they do in other parts of the field where a field goal is not on the table yet.
Well, the coach from Arkansas, the high school coach, I can't remember his name now. I believe it's Kelly. Last name's Kelly.
Devin Kelly. Yeah. I've had a chance to meet him. Yeah, he's a disciple of my stats too.
And I think for a while there, he was the hot thing, because he was like, "I'm going to onside kick it every time just because of the numbers."
Yeah, that's the scorecasting. They write about him in scorecasting, that book, I think.
Right. Yeah.
And go for it, onside kick it, everything.
He was popular for a couple years, and then they're like, "Yeah, we're not going to do that," even though the numbers maybe back him up some.
Brian, let me ask you about North Carolina this year. We're talking to Brian Fremeau. He's not going to claim it, but metrics guru here, and just tons of stuff on BCF Toys. The website is fascinating. But when I look at your numbers from last year, and y'all talked about them, Carolina's defense specifically, let's talk about this season for North Carolina. And this may not be a question that's easily answered, but from your data over the past, since 2007, what is a realistic improvement that a team could make? Or what have you seen maybe realistically in the stats and in your numbers over the course of that time, that a team that can go from near the bottom, where can they realistically get? And what should the fan base, based on the numbers, sort of expect?
That could be one of the blind spots that I'm not necessarily the most aggressive on projecting. So I lean heavily on recent performance as the starting point for my team projections. I found that to be true in my analysis, that for the bulk of teams, this is not certainly to every individual team, but the bulk of them play within a pretty consistent range year over year, or if there is a trend, it shows up in multiple years before you can kind of see where it's headed. So for that reason, North Carolina is going to start not too far from where it finished, as an example. But what is the potential, I guess, is what you're getting at. I mean, I mentioned USC as a surprise last year. I certainly under projected that team heading into last year. I didn't account for, because I don't really have a great way to plug that data point in. I didn't count for the dramatic roster turnover that they had, especially at those key offensive positions, plus a completely different scheme that was going to put up a highlight reel. And by doing so, I might have been dead right about their defense, but I wasn't right about them as their overall team because I under projected their offense. So if I think about North Carolina, it's maybe a similar story, that they could be not much better than the projected. I think I've got them at 106th best opponent adjusted defense, and the best offense. But if instead of 16th, they're 8th, if they're 6th, which is, I guess, within the realm of possibility, that could be the difference maker between them being a middling ACC team and a clear front runner. And I think that's without the defense even dramatically improving. If you add a little bit of defense improvement to that, then and then maybe you are far more of a confident contender. So it is a little bit of, I need some early season data to truly know if I'm off the mark to start the year or not. But I do find that for most teams, maybe North Carolina will be an exception to this, where they start is not going to be too far from where they finish. They might slide, 8 spots up or down for most teams over the course of the year. And then a few I missed the boat on, and it's kind of fun to know when you're wrong too. Even though I like being right, it's fun to see that college football isn't 100% predictable. It's maybe 75% predictable.
Well, that's the fun part of it, right? Is we can make all these projections, and then you have a pretty good idea, but you really don't know what's going to happen until things get kicked off. I wanted to stay on the offense side of things. You mentioned USC last year. The other really good example in your data is Oklahoma several years ago. I think it was the back-to-back years with Kyler Murray and Baker Mayfield, where they were probably the best offense in the country, got to the playoff, and the defense was just not any good. And that kind of showed itself in the playoff, but leading up to that point, they were okay. In terms of, when you look at Georgia and you look at Alabama and some of these teams that have been so successful, do you kind of have an idea of, are we at a point now where we can say offense can actually win you championships? Or do you not have enough data there to be able to say it's no longer just defense wins championships, it's actually one or the other, or maybe both?
Yeah, I do think it's complementary. I mean, I think heading into the 2021 season, so we're coming out of Alabama's 2020 season and LSU the year before that, it looked like there was a new era dawning, or had dawned, on offense is everything. Neither of those teams had poor defenses, but defense was not driving either of those two championship runs, and yet they both seemed unstoppable. Georgia flipped that a little bit. Both of the last few years, especially in 21, where they were performing at an elite defense that I don't think we thought was possible anymore. They were in my numbers. One of the things I was tracking all season was how close they were to matching the 2011 Alabama defense in terms of efficiency rates, which were just absurd. And so I do think that there's a balance that's struck. And I mentioned this earlier. I do think the true contenders are going to show up in the top 10 on both sides of the ball in all likelihood at the end of the year. And some of that has to do with perhaps just the way you have to almost dominate on both sides to truly ride out a year. I think there have been examples in the recent past where maybe the 12-team playoff is going to get some of these teams back on people's radar screen, but there are teams that trip up a couple of times that no one would have wanted to see in a playoff because they're at that elite level on both sides of the ball. They lost the wrong two games, so they lost at the wrong moment in the year. they're going to get an extra mulligan on that this coming year. When the 24 playoff starts. I see balance as being the key. Some of the numbers that I post on my website are basically just net numbers, the raw offensive rating versus minus the raw defensive rating. Net points per drive is one of the ones that I lean on. I actually just posted a recent graphic that showed that the top teams now for 5 straight seasons, championship seasons, and for most of the late BCS and playoff year, are dominating both sides of the ball to have a net rating of points per drive of +2. I mean, what does 2 mean? That means you're scoring 2 more points on your possessions than your opponent is scoring on theirs. Over the course of an average game, that's going to work out to basically a comfortable 24-point win. And if a team is averaging that over the course of the year, whoever they're playing, they might be playing a slew of elite opponents, or they could be playing just a couple of them and just crushing everyone else. But they have to be strong on both sides of the ball to get near that number. And we've now seen it that the national champion is in that stratosphere pretty consistently in the current playoff era.
So obviously,
North Carolina was 0.12 in net points per drive last year, just for reference for the people listening.
Yeah, and if you're +2 over your opponent, it's a comfortable 24-point win ish, which is fascinating. That margin seems small, but it's really actually huge when it's laid out.
Yeah, that +2 doesn't show up on every possession, right? You're not scoring 7 and giving up 5 as an example every time. And depending on the order and the sequence of it, it might feel like a runaway out of the gate, and it might feel like you don't pull away until late. But it really does play out. I mean, college football maybe is one of the distinctions from the NFL is that there's so many teams that the top teams, like, they beat everybody. They don't go 10-6 and they're a solid playoff team, or 11-5 like you see in the NFL. You win, and you win over and over again. And the Sabans of the world, maybe there's only one of them, maybe Kirby Smart's going to join that category, have built a machine that can basically do that week in and week out. That's unusual, at least in my college football fandom. Those things don't happen over 15-year stretches like they have over the last 15 years. But I do wonder if, again, the playoff is a wrinkle that might change those numbers. But I still see the dominating on both sides being the key, and they clearly are loading their rosters in a way that allows them to do that too. That's the game changer I think we've seen of the last half decade, especially, it feels like.
So wrapping up here, I want to ask you about your South Carolina, North Carolina projections. I'm gonna stay away from teasing it. I'm gonna let you talk about it. You have, and again, your website, BCF Toys, is amazing. If you like numbers, folks, if you like to look at numbers, go to his website. But Brian, talk about your projection here with South Carolina, North Carolina coming up on Saturday.
Sure. Well, I make a projection for every FBS game, and they're all there on my site. In fact, you can look back at all my projections all the way back to 2011 if you want to figure out how smart or dumb I probably am. The caveat is I'm projecting every game, and by no means do I think I'm going to be right on every game. That's just not how this thing works. But the inputs are my opponent adjusted offense and defense and overall team ratings. I do project a bit of pace into this. So teams that, play low number possession games, think the service academies, usually end up with lower total scoring games than those with more. But even those numbers are not too dramatic. But I pick out a South Carolina win, or I'm projecting a South Carolina win by, and everything's in decimals here, by 2.6 points. The output is decimals, not because I think that somehow the rules are going to change by Saturday, and we're going to be counting that way, but more of a way to say that what edge of a close matchup are we? Are we, a home field advantage might be worth 2.5 points roughly over the course of, if you count all teams together in one bucket. And so some people do use my numbers when they're looking at lines, and maybe I do definitely track what my numbers do against closing lines is how I publish it. That might not be where the value is if you're interested in in wagering, the value is certainly on opening lines. But I basically publish it as a way to say how close are my numbers to the reality? Am I totally off the mark? Am I basically in the ballpark? And even just the tweaks I do every year to try to get those pacing numbers right. I mean, the new clock rules this year are going to have an impact. They appear to have already had an impact on numbers of plays and possibly even numbers of possessions per game. So I get at a number. We'll see if this turns out to be a 32-29 win or a 33-30 game. But that's the number I'm spitting out this week.
Certainly, I know people watching this will be like, "Oh, I know what he's talking about." But hey, you've put it together based in your numbers and all that, so it's fascinating to me. And for health's sake, I would like the game not to be that close, but everybody has it that way. Let me ask one question about the sort of the good offense, bad defense, or vice versa. Where does one team need to be on both of those scales to win 10 games, 11 games? Not to be elite, but like realistically for North Carolina to win 10 or 11 games or a team like them, how much of that gap needs to close in your numbers for that to happen? I mean, have you put that together? Is that something that you can see in written form for Carolina fans to sort of understand?
Good question, because maybe in Carolina's case, it's that the offense is going to clearly be the lead. I've seen Iowa fans who are looking at the complete opposite. We can win 10 games by having a trash offense if our defense is the top 2 or 3 in the country, and they've sort of proven that to be true. It's interesting. So 10 games feels a little bit like you should be pushing the top 20 in both. If you said 8 or 9 games, then I bet you can get away with being in maybe a top 20 in one and maybe only merely a top 50 in the other. And again, it comes down to the teams that win 8-9 games are I think generally only a few plays and a few possessions away from winning only 7 or 6. They win a few close games. They don't dominate 10 out of 12 games. They win the ones that count, and that's what gets them to 8 or 9. Sometimes you see some 11-win teams that only win 9, and they somehow just got unlucky on the 2 that they could have run away with. But yeah, if you're a Carolina fan looking for a season that, well, you guys tell me what is the baseline expectation versus what is the dream? I mean, if you want to win 9 games, I might say push that offensive rating clearly into the top 10, if not higher. And again, possible. I mean, I think certainly with a star quarterback, that's possible. I'm a Notre Dame fan. Everyone's drinking all the Kool-Aid after week 0 with our new quarterback. The sky's the limit with the offense now. And yeah, that pushes what would have been 50-50 games into a more comfortable category, or maybe puts you in a game that you're going to be a clear underdog into a more winnable game, because you can push that. So I don't know if I'm being dodgy on the question, Tommy, but I do think there's a range that I don't know which lever you can pull, but pulling that offensive lever as far into the top 10 as possible will really raise the ceiling for Carolina.
Muted, Greg. I get to say that to you. First time for everything.
Brian, one thing that we've talked about this offseason kind of speaks to that point. But Carolina was in 9 games last year, decided by a touchdown or less, and they were 6-3 in those games, and ended up going 9-5. So the likelihood of continuing to win that high of a percentage of those games, I would assume, is unlikely. And so you got to have a wider an improvement from the defense, especially, but the offense can be a little bit better too to kind of carry the load. Therefore, you don't have to bank on winning so many close games. But
that's right. That pendulum doesn't just automatically swing back, but over the course of years, you're going to win about 50% of your toss-ups. So the more that you can move off of the toss-up category into the 7-10 point win category, the better off you'll be as a program.
Well, Brian, this has been fantastic. Like I said, I've followed you for a long, long time, so I'm glad we finally were able to discuss these things, and glad Tommy was along for the ride.
Definitely along for the ride.
Well, I enjoyed it as well. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to keep up with your stuff. If you want to follow Brian on Twitter, it's at BC Fremeau. So it's Fremeao. We've got a lot of those going on with Elliot Cadeau and now you. So North Carolina fans should be familiar, but it's BC Fremeau, and that's at on Twitter. BCF Toys on the internet. It is fascinating to talk to you, man. I really appreciate you coming on, especially this close to the season. I know your schedule's hectic, but making time for us makes us feel good. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks.
Thank you. And Greg, let's talk about it a little bit. Fascinating, the numbers. I know Buck loves the numbers as well, and you guys get into it, and we'll talk about that on the prediction show. If you're listening to this before Wednesday at 9 o'clock, I might change my mind on a few. If you're listening to this afterwards, I don't know what I did, but you'll find out. But Greg, why do numbers matter so much for you when you analyze these games? You covered Carolina forever. What makes the number aspect of it so great for you?
Well, it's really just in talking with various coaches, as I mentioned, Butch and Larry, really kind of set the tone for me and said, you've got to find advantages wherever you can. And if you're looking just at the total numbers, it really doesn't do you any good. And I think kind of a great example was North Carolina last year defensively. The Virginia game, Carolina allowed 28 points in that game. And people who look at that score and say, well, it's Virginia, they're a Power 5 program. 28 points is not bad for Carolina's defense. When you actually start looking at the numbers, Virginia only scored 14 points per game against ACC teams outside of North Carolina. And they scored double their average against Carolina. So when you look at it from that perspective, you can say, wait a minute, that was a really poor defensive performance. Even when you're looking in general terms, it doesn't look so bad. And it just provides you a little bit more insight. And we're fortunate to have Brian and Bill Connolly does SP Plus on the basketball side of things. We have Evan Miyakawa. We have Ken Pomeroy. All these guys really make a point to kind of dive deep into the numbers to say, this is what is separating these really good teams. And I just think that's the best way to kind of get a handle. Does it, as Brian said, does that mean these guys are going to be 100% correct all the time? Of course not. Nobody's claiming that they are. But it gives you an educated guess, and it gives you some insight into what's actually happening in these games. And I think that's the best way to be able to define how good a team can potentially be. I mean, when you look at a Georgia and they're top 5 in offense and defense, well, yeah, they're going to compete for the national championship. When you look at North Carolina, that's top 20 offensively, but one of the worst defenses in the country. Well, that defense has to get better very quickly. And let me add this in here, Tommy, before we get out. People like to talk about the big turnaround Gene had when he came in 2015, and he did. It was fantastic. North Carolina had fallen off the map 2014 and Vic Koning's last year. Larry Fedora did a great job with leadership for the team in the offseason. Gene put in his system. And really kind of what happened was North Carolina from 14 to 15 improved 59 spots in FEI. That's a lot.
That's a lot.
Kind of apply that to this year. Carolina, I believe what I say, 118th last year. So that gets you up to, 59th this year.
Yeah.
If you give Drake May a top 60 defense, all right, now you're competing for the ACC championship legitimately. And if you can compete for the ACC championship, of course, you put your name on the list for contention for the college football playoffs. So the offense, yes, needs to get better, especially considering how they closed the season last year in the first year of Chip Lindsey. But the defense really needs to take a massive step forward. And the data that Brian provides, as well as Bill Connolly and some of those guys provide, is very clear in those aspects.
Yep. It's going to be a fun time watching North Carolina. Ultimately, it only matters what the scoreboard says at the end of the game. But to get to that point, a lot is going on. North Carolina opens the season Saturday, 7:30 against South Carolina. Brian's got them as a 2.6 point dog, I guess, if we want to call it that at this point. But a lot can go on between now and then, and probably will, and a lot happens once the ball goes up. Mac talks about opening games are crapshoots because you never know how good you are until you actually get into it. We'll find out for North Carolina on Saturday. That's Greg Barnes. I'm Tommy Ashley. Shout out to Brian Fremeau, guest. Just a smart guy with numbers. It's fascinating. Not my cup of tea because I don't do math, but certainly fascinating aspect of it. And I know it makes Greg smile. So it's all good. Next level, Johnny T-shirt and JohnnyT-shirt.com. We'll be back later in the season or later in the coming weeks with more interesting and deep guests right here on Next Level.